Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Güven Çatak, Chapter Chair of Games for Change Turkey. And now for our first main stage session of the Games for Learning programming track, sponsored by Zynga. For more than 2 decades, learning games have challenged the way we think about education, engagement, and the potential of play. Few organizations have been part of that evolution, quite like Filament games. Today, we will take a look back at years of experimentation and success from a studio that has created over 450 learning game experiences and hear what the future may hold in store for games that educate and inspire. Let's welcome to the stage Dan White, CEO of Filament Games. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. So Filament was born in 2005, just a couple years after Games for Change, which is hard to believe at this point. And so it's a great time to do a little bit of prognostication and a little bit of reflection on the last 20 years. I'm going to warn you in advance that the reflection part is going to be a little bit more focused on some of the fumbles, because I think that the mistakes and the challenges and the failures are a little bit more instructive. And then we can put on our optimist hats when we look forward into the future. Actually, I have no idea how to advance my slides. That's probably this thing right here. Use the force. Okay. All right, so it's not this button. There we go. All right. Cool. You just have to pray to the fickle gods. All right, so this is elementary school for me. As you can already see, there, this is kind of like the golden decade of learning games many, many years ago. You can see this original dichotomy forming in terms of quiz games versus what I'm going to convince you should now be called LAD games. That's my acronym. I want you to spread it far and wide. It stands for Learning via Agentic Discovery. I've been looking for shorthand for a really long time for how to describe the difference between these types of games, games with systems and verbs and deep mechanics and identities. And I think LAD's pretty good. So I'm going to say that again and again throughout this presentation until it's deep into your brain. This is where my journey started, building virtual science museums in Active Worlds, which was the most kludgy, awful game development engine ever. And what we built was frankly terrible. But students seemed to like it, and so the thinking was, well, if they like this and it's terrible, what if it was good? So I went to University of Madison and I studied with these people, Jim G., Kurt Squire, Constance Steinkuhler. And they said a lot of really smart things, but chief among them was this idea that a bunch of time had passed and now games were a very respectable medium, very powerful medium, very sophisticated medium, capable of doing really powerful things. So let's use them to make really powerful learning games. And by the way, 20 years had passed since that original golden age that I mentioned. Jim G. was 20 years after the Oregon Trail, and as you can see, there was a whole bunch of time where really nothing happened, a whole bunch of primordial ooze. So Jim said, go form a company, and we said, yes, sir. And we called it Filament Games, and our original slogan was very refined. It was learning games that don't suck. And what we meant by that was basically LAD games, learning via agentic discovery. What we meant was that games with deep systems, mechanics, identities that let you play with verbs to learn learning objectives. So this was our very first game prototype. I know it looks like a murder simulator, but it's actually a game about Roman history. It went terribly. We designed a $500,000 game and we had a budget of $0. So we didn't get very far. This was our second game, went a little bit better, a game about project management. But we made $4 an hour when we tallied up how much time we spent on that game versus what we got paid. Third game prototype, Ocean Science game. We presented this at the Games Learning and Society Conference, rest in peace. Ben Sawyer there saw the game and he invited us to present at the Serious Games Conference, rest in peace. And and there was a funder in the audience there, and he said, submit a grant. So 2 guys with the dream of making LAD games is cute, but 2 guys with money is a business. So now we are officially a business. And we went and we took that ocean game prototype and we made this big 3D underwater explorable environment with deep mechanics for making scientific arguments, teeming with life, big playable exploration area that you could explore and high production values. And so naturally, at this point, we had crossed the finish line. We realized our dream of making a learning via agentic discovery game, bringing it to fruition, and we lived happily ever after. But of course, what actually happened is we took it into schools, and schools were like, wait, how do we use a big long-form 3D game And the IT people were like, our computers can't run this, et cetera, et cetera. And so we took another swing at that, and we made this very much more modestly scoped Flash game about kinetic and potential energy. And it was used quite a bit by teachers, actually. And so we learned very quickly, and thus began the age of Flash, which lasted for the better part of the first 2 decades of Filament's history as an organization, making lad light games, classroom-sized games. And they had to be served up via browser. That was extremely important. Now, in the beginning, most of the time when we were pitching these games, we were pitching to people with low game literacy. So just the very idea of a positive impact game was often considered kind of an oxymoron. And they were typically, the buyers were typically deciding between a game as an intervention versus something else. Around the same time, we also thought that in addition to developing games for clients, we would try to build our own IP. So we turned NGSS standards into science playgrounds. We made curriculum to go along with them. We did efficacy studies, teacher PD materials, et cetera, et cetera. But while we did make some sales in schools, what we ultimately came back to is the sensation that we were selling kind of a nice to have into an environment where they're just trying to meet their basic day-to-day needs. Around the same time, there was a report called the Horizon Report that came out. A show of hands of anybody who ever has heard of this or read this report. Okay, nobody, okay, good. So, so the Horizon Report basically predict what the up-and-coming education technologies were that were exciting. And game-based learning from 2012 to 2013 was listed on the 2 to 3 year horizon. It's a little awkward, right, when you're 2 years into listing it on the 2-year horizon. Around the same time, I went to an EdTech conference and somebody said to me, game-based learning has a bright future and always will. 2013, at this very conference, Games for Change, put this slide up on a presentation. This was my prediction, that schools were going to start adopting increasingly complex and laddie learning via agentic discovery games. We haven't quite gotten there yet. Still mostly quiz games used in schools. And then Flash died, RIP Flash, and then tablets came out. Tablets did a really interesting thing to the industry because they made the learning literally at your fingertips. It's very easy to access the games. So tablet games suddenly took over the studio. And then same thing happened with VR when VR made game-based learning immersive, and then when 6DoF controllers made it embodied, it happened again. And then this thing happened. Some of you probably remember this, although we try not to. And this was actually a really positive thing for the game-based learning industry. As you can see by this pretty significant spike in headcount that we had in 2022, when COVID was kind of in that weird place between or post the real lockdown part, but things really haven't thawed back out yet. And the reason for this is that learning games and just digital learning in general was kind of plan A for a hot second. It was really exciting for the world of game-based learning. As you can see, as there was this course correction for the entertainment game industry, we experienced the same thing on the learning game side as digital learning in specific kind of became plan B again. While that was happening, we also raised some funding to take another crack at developing our own IP to take this back into the world. And this was based on the idea that robotics is sort of this educational superfood, but it's very expensive. And so we made a game where you can build, design, and program robots. And this was intended to be like the ultimate lad game. We wanted to make this big sandbox that you could really sink your teeth into and have the opportunity to realize sort of that initial vision that we were going for when we founded the company. And we thought if schools are a difficult place to make these long-form lad games work, then we would try the consumer entertainment market. And so we did that. We also made VR versions and XR versions, and we got pretty good traction initially. We had 35,000 wish lists when we launched at Steam, and we had 25 million YouTube plays. So this wasn't just like a lack of marketing or anything like that. And while we did make sales, we walked away from this experience still not feeling exactly like the consumer entertainment market was this promised land for the type of long-form lad games that we wanted to make as a studio. Now, interesting case study that I just want to mention really quickly, and that is that around the same time, I do think that having a publishing partner would have made a significant difference for this market. So Main Assembly and Filament were both talking to Team 17 as a publisher at that point. They ended up going with Main Assembly because they were a little bit ahead of us in their development cycle, and they did quite well. Plasma was another sort of robotic system sandboxy game that launched around the same time, not explicitly for educational purposes, but really struggled, even though from my perspective, and I think the perspective of many, it was a superior game. Then we went back to schools with the same product, and we learned something very interesting, which is that part of the reason that schools actually want to do robotics in the first place is that it is hands-on and that the students are off screens. So that was a little bit of a sad trombone moment, but definitely learned that screen time still very much matters in school, in which I completely understand. Here's me pitching my son a squash. Sometimes things are just better in the real world, and you absolutely should try this at home. One thing this also highlighted for me is that Roboco, our engineering game, is actually quite a difficult game. And there feels to me, after 20 years of working with schools and games, that there's maybe a little bit of a double standard around this because we don't care about things being hard if we're talking about tests or homework assignments or projects. But with games, it's a little bit of a taboo. So I still worry that there's maybe this misconception that the purpose of the game is to be the sugar that kind of helps the proverbial medicine go down. That's a talk unto itself. Meanwhile, we also jumped over to Roblox and experimented with that. We made a version of the experience on the Roblox platform. That again, oops, don't hit the back button, is another talk unto itself. But suffice to say, you can get really crazy, exciting numbers on Roblox really fast, but still not exactly the promised land for long-form LAD games from our perspective. I love, this is my first time using AI to create images in my slide, and it's fun. It's like a Where's Waldo for like the absurd, the absurd thing that's completely wrong. Probably not difficult Waldo to find in this case, but my point here is brings us to present day, 2026, the one that's out of order and not the actual year. But we made 500 games at this point, and it's just sort of a quick fun fact. I just wanted to kind of give you a rundown of the different subject areas we cover. You can see there's a lot of science, a lot of civics, thanks to iCivics in particular. We've done many games with iCivics over the years, and language arts percolating to the top. No surprise here, most of those 500 games have been web and mobile games over the years. 2D, this one really jumped off the page at me. Obviously, this is biased a little bit because of the years where we were exclusively a 2D studio, but 2D is still alive and well and going strong. Middle school being the sweet spot, no surprise there. So as we look forward to the future, it's obviously very hard to predict sort of where things go in the next 20 years because things are moving very quickly, but I'm going to try anyway. And again, this is where we get a little optimistic. So I read this book in 2018. This was 4 years before the ChatGPT moment. He was basically positing that the world of work is going to change a lot. And if the world of work is going to change, then it begs the question of like what we should actually do to prepare students for that world. And in my opinion, there's a lot of different things that we can do, but one really important thing is to teach people to do human things. And one really good proxy for human things is 21st century skills, higher order thinking skills, future-facing skills, I think more important now than ever. A really good pedagogy for teaching those types of skills is project-based learning. Problem with project-based learning is very difficult to scale, and I think game-based learning as a cousin to project-based learning captures a lot of what's great about it, but in this highly scalable form factor. The other thing being interest development. Depending on which survey you look at, somewhere between 57 and 75% of Gen Z is interested in being influencers. I think we can all agree that games have this really unique and compelling ability to engender interest, and perhaps we can engender interest in STEAM and things of that nature as opposed to just influencing. Of course, none of this matters if AI is usurping the cognitive load, right? So we need to make sure that the educational tools that we're developing still place that cognitive load squarely on the shoulders of the students. How do we do that? Well, I think we just ask more of students. So an AI-enabled student, now granted a lot of it's just being banned right now in schools, but to the extent that it's not, and probably won't be to the same extent in the future, we need to make sure that we're designing and building games that are hard, right? There's the dark souls of cognitive load, essentially. I really like this slide because this is a compilation of some of the most sophisticated robots that students have made in Roboco. As you can see, the bottom left one is actually a fully functional 3D printer. Definitely some cognitive load involved in creating these things. There's a YouTube channel called Huge is True that I really like that's optimistic stories about science and technology. And so in the spirit of that, I'm going to offer some optimistic ways that potentially AI could impact the game-based learning space, understanding that is ethically fraught in many ways. This is a dashboard that we did with iCivics a long while back. Point here is basically it can be very hard to communicate out to educators what's worth knowing about what happens in a game space. So one potential fruitful application of AI in games is if it's game context aware and embedded in the space, it can potentially analyze that data and help create useful assertions about what's going on cognitively in the students' heads as they're playing the games. This is a mind map generated by ASU's Endless Lab just from watching Roboco. So it watches games and it can create a mind map about what sort of cognitive spaces students might be engaging with as they engage with a game, which I think is just really cool. This is a prototype that we created called Tavix, which is basically an embedded AI engine inside the game that understands what engineering looks like, understands what building looks like, and can dialogue with players about that. So this kind of thing could potentially replace tutorials, which 0 people love typically in games, and also potentially help get students more toward that zone of proximal development inside video games, which I think is really exciting. I was going for kind of like a Fitbit of the mind analogy with this one, but I do think that AI is embedded in games when they're context aware, could potentially also change what happens in the game depending on what the player is doing, what their affinities are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, et cetera. AI could commoditize quiz game slop by just making it easier to develop, and if the business model is commoditized and maybe quiz game slop goes away, I think we could all agree that'd be kind of cool. AI could potentially help free up educators through taking on some of the administrative burden. And then if they have more time, maybe they can experiment with more progressive pedagogies like game-based learning and project-based learning. And then this is maybe one of the biggest ones from my opinion. So we've developed about 500 games across the last 20 years, which sounds like a lot when you think about it, but also we need video, high-quality LAD games. God, I haven't said LAD in a while. Sorry, I kind of was remiss there. Learning via agentic discovery games. Tell your friends. We need LAD games for every subject area, every learning objective in the world. And at the pace we're going right now, we're going to need a lot more filaments to do that. But if AI brings the speed up and the cost of development down, then maybe we can make the next 500 learning games in more like 2 years instead of 200. We could also be more ambitious with our scope. Every time we're developing a game, we're always scope limited and time limited and budget constrained. And then Javon's paradox, this originally was formulated based on the idea that the steam engine would bring down the cost of coal, bring down consumption of coal, but in fact it did just the opposite, despite making the processing of that coal more efficient because it was lower cost. So maybe AI brings development costs down, unlocks latent demands in particularly price-sensitive sectors like corporate training, et cetera, and we see latent demand unlocked for these types of products if they're available at a lower price. So let's try to land the plane. Going back to our analogy about the age of the planet, sometimes things take a long time to mature. I think when we founded Filament, we sort of thought we were over here on the right-hand side where humans are kind of starting to stand upright, and we're getting to like the good stuff. This is where the action happens. But I think we were probably maybe more over here in Trilobite Town. I just kind of like underestimated that we were perhaps potentially a little bit earlier on in the grand scheme of things than I originally thought. I think game-based learning is still very niche, and though it holds a ton of potential, we have a ton of space to grow, and in fact need to grow. And I'd like to end by revisiting this prediction from 2013. You'll notice, cleverly, I didn't put a timeline on the bottom. I just said near-term, long-term, which is open to definition. And I think this is still true. I just think that originally when I made the slide, I was thinking more like 5 years, and it's probably more like 25 or something like that. So I hope you'll join us in rolling up your sleeves because we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of educational games to develop. And as far as I'm concerned, we're just getting started. Thank you.